Welcome back to the Romper Room podcast. I hope you had a great weekend. This is Phil and Jen, and today we will continue our series on running deep in poker tournaments. Over the next 3 days, we will be diving into the 3-volume series of Harrington on Hold'em.
Harrington on Hold'em,
That's
a classic, for good reason.
It is, right?
Dan Harrington, he's a World Series of Poker champion himself. He really lays out a framework for thinking about tournament poker that's stood the test of time.
And we're starting with Volume 1. Is that right? Strategic play. I know you've got all the notes and stuff from the listener who requested this deep dive. What's the mission here?
Yeah, they're looking to get a handle on those core concepts,
Okay.
the stuff Harrington emphasizes that makes or breaks tournament success. They played some poker, but want to take it up a notch.
Perfect. So we're not assuming they're total beginners, but we're not going super advanced either.
Exactly. Volume 1 is all about building that solid foundation. It's actually divided into 3 parts: understanding the game, playing styles, and reading the table. Pretty straightforward.
So first up, understanding the game. What's Harrington hitting on here?
Well, he starts by talking about how poker and No Limit Hold'em specifically has evolved, It's blown up in popularity,
Sure.
especially tournaments. And this is thanks to things like televised poker and online platforms, obviously.
Right.
But the fundamentals, well, that's where it all starts.
Right. Because knowing the basic rules isn't enough to win tournaments.
Exactly. Harrington, he really drives home the point that No Limit Hold'em is a game of incomplete information.
Okay.
You're making decisions with limited knowledge about your opponent's hands and intentions.
So kind of like, I don't know, trying to solve a puzzle, but you're missing some of the pieces.
Perfect analogy.
Oh, good.
He talks about 4 key factors players consider.
Right.
The likelihood they have the best hand, their mathematical odds, whether their opponent's hand might improve, and the money odds being offered by the pot.
Right.
It's this combination of probability and psychology that makes it so fascinating.
Okay, so more than just the cards you're holding, there's this whole other layer of strategy and deduction involved.
Absolutely. And that's something beginners often miss.
Right.
Harrington actually has this great conversation in the book between a beginner and a professional player.
Oh, okay.
To illustrate this point.
What happens?
Well, the beginner is hyper-focused on his own cards.
Okay.
Trying to figure out if he has the best hand. He's completely ignoring everything else going on at the table.
Right.
The betting patterns, the other players' behavior, the overall dynamics.
So missing the forest for the trees, basically.
Exactly. And the professional player points out that there's so much more to consider than just your own cards.
Right.
Harrington then goes on to list 11 crucial elements that make up a hand in No Limit Hold'em, going way beyond those 2 cards you're dealt.
11 elements. That seems like a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but it just highlights the complexity of the game, right?
Sure.
You've got things like position, stack size, opponent behavior, pot odds, they all factor into your decisions.
So you're not just playing your cards, you're playing the players, the situation, the whole shebang.
That's a great way to put it.
Is it? Okay, good.
And that's really the core of what Harrington is trying to convey in this first section of the book. Understanding these elements and how they interact. It's essential to becoming a successful tournament player.
This is all great foundational stuff. Our listener is definitely going to appreciate having these concepts laid out so clearly. But I'm also curious about those different playing styles.
That's coming up in part 2. We'll dive into the conservative, aggressive, and super aggressive approaches and why there's no one-size-fits-all best way to play. Welcome back to the Romper Room podcast, ready to explore these different playing styles in Harrington on Hold'em.
Absolutely. In the last part, we established that No Limit Hold'em is so much more than just the cards you're dealt.
Right.
Now, I'm really curious to hear about these different approaches, how they work, and when you might use one over another.
Well, Harrington breaks down the 3 main styles: conservative, aggressive, and super aggressive. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
And understanding them is key to adapting to different situations and opponents.
Okay, let's start with conservative. What's the philosophy behind this style?
Conservative play is all about minimizing risk and waiting for strong opportunities.
Okay.
They're patient, disciplined, and they really focus on playing premium hands.
Yeah.
Think of it like a sniper, waiting for the perfect shot.
So they're not going to be chasing every draw or bluffing aggressively.
Not typically.
Okay.
They'd rather let their opponents make the mistakes
Right.
while they steadily build their stack.
Makes sense.
It's a solid, consistent approach, especially for beginners who are still getting a feel for the game.
Makes sense. So when is the conservative style most effective?
Well, Harrington points out that it was particularly prevalent in the early days of poker tournaments back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, okay.
Tournaments were less common then, and the overall skill level was lower.
So in those days, just playing tight and waiting for strong hands could get you pretty far.
Exactly.
Okay.
But as poker evolved and tournaments became more popular, other styles emerged.
Right.
The game got more competitive, and players realized they needed to be more proactive.
Enter the aggressive style.
Right. This is where things start to heat up.
Okay.
Aggressive players are willing to play a wider range of hands, bluff more frequently, and bet more aggressively to control the pot.
Mm-hmm.
They apply constant pressure, forcing opponents to make tough decisions.
Sounds exciting. It's like they're dictating the flow of the game, not just reacting to it.
Exactly. They're not afraid to take calculated risks and mix things up to keep their opponents guessing.
Okay.
This style is often associated with some of the most successful tournament players.
I can see why. If you can master aggression, you can really put your opponents on the back foot. But what about taking it even further? You mentioned a super aggressive style too.
Now that's where things get really wild. Super aggressive players, they almost seem to throw caution to the wind.
Oh, wow.
They'll play almost any two cards, bluff relentlessly, and constantly put their opponents in tough spots.
Sounds like a high wire act. Is this even a viable strategy?
It can be, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart.
No.
It takes exceptional reading abilities, timing, and a deep understanding of tournament dynamics to pull it off. It's high risk, high reward.
Got it. So you've got these three distinct styles, but I imagine a good player doesn't just stick to one rigidly, right?
Absolutely not. Harrington emphasizes the importance of being adaptable
Okay.
and what he calls modulating your style based on the situation.
So you might start out conservative, but shift to a more aggressive approach as the tournament progresses.
Yeah.
Or if you find yourself at a loose, passive table.
Exactly. It's all about reading the table, assessing your opponents, and adjusting your play accordingly. A skilled player might even blend elements of different styles depending on the specific hand or circumstance.
That makes a lot of sense. Being able to adapt is crucial in any game, but especially in poker, where the dynamics are constantly shifting.
Yeah.
But how do you know when to make these adjustments? What cues should you be looking for?
That's where observation becomes critical.
Right.
Harrington dedicates a significant portion of the book to reading the table,
Okay.
picking up on tells, analyzing betting patterns, understanding your opponent's tendencies. We'll delve deeper into that in the next part.
I can't wait. This has already given me a whole new perspective on how to approach tournament poker. But before we move on, I'm curious about this tournament game plan that Harrington mentions.
Yeah.
What exactly does that entail?
It's essentially a strategy for navigating the different stages of a tournament.
Okay.
Because how you play in the early stages will be quite different from how you play as the blinds increase and the pressure mounts.
Makes sense. So how should your game plan change as the tournament progresses?
Well, in the early stages, when the blinds are low and stacks are deep, you have more room to maneuver. You might be more inclined to play a wider range of hands, experiment a bit, and try to build your stack.
But as the blinds go up, you need to become more selective with your starting hands and focus on preserving your chips.
Exactly. The margin for error shrinks significantly.
Right.
And in the later stages, when the blinds are high and the stacks are shallow, it often becomes more about making calculated shoves and navigating all-in confrontations.
Sounds intense.
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
And Harrington stresses the importance of tailoring your game plan to the specific type of tournament you're playing.
Okay, what are some of the different types of tournaments he covers?
He talks about live events, online tournaments, single-table satellites, multi-table events, each with its own unique dynamics and considerations.
So, for example, how would playing in a live tournament differ from playing online?
Live tournaments are all about reading those physical tells we talked about earlier.
Right.
You can observe your opponents directly, pick up on subtle cues, and try to get a feel for their playing style.
While online, you're relying more on betting patterns, player statistics, and any notes you might have taken on your opponents.
Exactly.
Okay.
And online tournaments are generally faster paced.
Right.
So you have to make decisions more quickly and adjust to a different rhythm.
What about single-table tournaments versus multi-table events? What are the key differences there?
Single-table tournaments, or sit-and-goes, are typically winner-take-all events with a smaller field and a faster structure.
Right.
The strategies can be quite different because you're often battling for that top spot from the get-go.
So you might need to be more aggressive in a sit-and-go to build a stack quickly and put pressure on your opponents.
That's one approach.
Okay.
While in multi-table events, you have more time to maneuver, and the strategies tend to evolve over the course of the tournament as the field narrows and the blinds escalate.
This is all incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see how much strategic depth there is to tournament poker. It's not just about luck or knowing the basic rules. It's about having a solid game plan and adapting it based on the specific tournament format and your opponent's tendencies.
That's exactly what Harrington drives home in Volume 1.
Yeah.
He provides a framework for understanding the complexities of the game and making informed decisions in a variety of situations.
Welcome back to the Romper Room podcast. We've been on quite a journey through the world of no-limit hold'em tournaments,
Ah,
guided by Dan Harrington's wisdom, of course.
it is fascinating, isn't it, how much depth there is to this game. I
Yeah.
mean, we've gone from those fundamental concepts like, incomplete information to understanding these different playing styles
Right.
and even, developing a whole tournament game plan.
It's clear there's so much more to it than just knowing the rules.
Yeah.
And I'm really intrigued by this idea of reading the table that you mentioned in the last part. Harrington dedicates a whole section of the book to it.
Yeah. He does. And it's arguably one of the most crucial aspects of becoming a successful tournament player, really. It's all about observation,
Okay.
both of your opponents and of yourself.
So it's like becoming a poker detective.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that.
So what are we looking for when we're trying to, read the table? What kind of clues should we be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, the most obvious clues are the betting patterns.
Okay.
How much are players betting? Are they raising frequently? Are they calling or folding more often?
Yeah.
These patterns can reveal a lot about the strength of their hands and their overall strategy.
So if someone's betting aggressively, they probably have a strong hand.
Okay.
Right. And if they're checking and calling passively, they might be weaker.
Well, it's not always that straightforward,
Okay.
but those are good starting points. You
Yeah.
have to consider the context of the hand, the position of the players, and any previous betting patterns you've observed. It's all about putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Okay, so betting patterns are one piece of the puzzle. What else are we looking for?
That's where those tells we talked about earlier come into play. Remember, these are those subtle physical cues, They might betray a player's true feelings or intentions.
Right, like a trembling hand when someone's bluffing, or a quick glance at their chips when they have a strong hand.
Yeah.
But Harrington said not all tells are created equal, didn't he?
Exactly. He categorizes tells into 3 types: facial expressions, general body language, and hand motions. And he emphasizes that hand motions are the most reliable
Okay.
because they're often subconscious and harder to control.
So if someone's hand hesitates before reaching for chips, that's a more trustworthy tell than, say, a forced smile.
Precisely.
Okay.
Of course, you never want to rely on a single tell in isolation.
Right.
It's about combining those observations,
Yeah.
with the betting patterns, the player's history, the overall context of the hand.
It sounds like reading the table effectively takes a lot of practice and keen observation skills.
It definitely does. But the more you play and the more you pay attention, the better you'll become at recognizing those subtle patterns.
Yeah.
And interpreting them correctly.
And Harrington provides some great examples in the book to illustrate how this works in practice, right?
He does. There's one example that really stands out where a player makes this huge bet on the river, seemingly representing a very strong hand. But by carefully analyzing the previous betting rounds and considering the player's typical patterns, Harrington deduces that the large bet is actually a desperate bluff.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's not just about the size of the bet. It's about understanding the story the betting tells and how it fits into the overall narrative of the hand.
Exactly. It's like being a detective. You're piecing together the clues to solve the mystery
Right.
of what your opponents are holding.
I love it. But it's not just about observing our opponents, is it? Harrington also talks about the importance of observing ourselves.
He does. And this might be even more challenging than reading our opponents.
Okay, yeah.
It's about, being aware of our own actions and how they might be perceived by others at the table.
So are we giving away too much information with our facial expressions or our betting patterns, or are we projecting the image we want to project? Is that what you mean?
That's exactly it. It's
Yeah.
about stepping outside ourselves and becoming an observer of our own game. Harrington calls it pursuing a balanced strategy, making sure our actions align with our intended table image and that we're not becoming predictable.
Because if we're predictable, our opponents can exploit that, right? Like if we always fold to big bets, they'll know they can bluff us easily.
Absolutely. And Harrington gives some great examples in the book where players they misjudge their own image at the table, and this leads to costly mistakes.
So it's a delicate balance between reading our opponents and reading ourselves, understanding how our actions are being interpreted, and adjusting accordingly.
That's the heart of poker, really. It's a game of constant adaptation and adjustment,
Yeah.
both to our opponents and to ourselves.
Now, we've talked about observing our opponents, observing ourselves, and gathering all this information. But the big question is, how do we actually use this information to make better decisions at the table?
Well, that's where I think experience and intuition come into play.
Okay.
The more you play, the more hands you analyze, the better you'll become at recognizing those subtle patterns and making accurate reads. You'll start to develop a feel for the game.
So it's like any skill, the more we practice, the sharper our instincts become. And Harrington on Hold'em gives us the foundation to build upon.
Exactly. By studying the concepts he lays out, analyzing the examples he provides, and then putting in the hours at the table, we can start to transform ourselves into more observant, more perceptive, and ultimately more successful poker players.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into Dan Harrington's Harrington on Hold'em. I feel like I've learned so much about the strategic depth of tournament poker.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you. It's such a fascinating game with so much to learn.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought. How can you use the power of observation, both of your opponents and of yourself, to gain a strategic advantage in your next poker tournament? Think about it, analyze your game, and keep those cards coming.
Good luck at the tables.